as for tonight, we're delighted to get Bill Rose back. In fact, tonight's program was specially designed to put him back to work at the Overby Center, get him out of retirement. Bill was a fellow, Overby Fellow of mine for 7 years. It was great having him in an office next door. And like most people from the Delta, Bill's a lot of fun and a gifted raconteur. So we're counting on our chairman, Charles Overby, to draw some good news stories from Bill this evening. So, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Curtis. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here tonight. Bill Rose tells all. That's a good headline. We'll see if we can fill in the blanks. Bill's had, when I think about living Mississippi journalists, journalists who live in Mississippi today, who've had remarkable careers, you have and will see the two most accomplished living Mississippi journalists in this room. Curtis Wilkie and Bill Rose, I think, are the two most accomplished living journalists in Mississippi. So it's going to be fun to have a conversation with Bill today. We have loosely themed our programs for the spring around 50 years after 1968. 68 was a tumultuous year and made headlines, as most of you know, even though you weren't born. In 1968, Bill Rose was the managing editor of the Daily Mississippian, and I was the editor. And it goes to show you how relationships that you forge here at Ole Miss stay with you the rest of your life. Neither of us could have imagined that we'd be sitting here 50 years later. And Gary Sisko was with us 50 years ago, an engineering student who, anyway, we all hang together, and so that's great. So Bill, as we go through your career and flesh out these stories, one thing I wanted to ask you is when you left Ole Miss in 1969, were you ambitious?
No, I was scared to death. I had no clue about journalism when I got to Ole Miss. And everything I knew, I gained here, but I didn't know if it was enough. So I was terrified to go out to my first job. Fortunately, it was close at home. It was in Greenville, Mississippi. So I was among people who were close to home and quickly made friends.
Well, I take offense to that statement that you just made, that you didn't know if you knew enough. You worked with me at the Daily Mississippian. Isn't that enough? Surely you would have grounded in a great professional career. But you're so soft-spoken, and your humility is so evident to everyone, and yet you've accomplished so much. So I find a dichotomy between your not being that ambitious and then you're doing so much. How do you account for being able to achieve so much and not being at least outwardly an ambitious person?
Fear. I was terrified of failure, and that's a great motivator. But you know what happens is when you get into journalism and you start to see your byline on the front page of a newspaper, and you chase a story and you expose hypocrisy, or you break a story that everyone else would just kill for, it does something to you. It gives you kind of a bloodlust, so to speak, to go out and do it again and again and again and again. So then whether you call it ego, whether you call it drive, whether you call it ambition, it's kindled and it's there. I don't like to talk about it that way. I'd much prefer to say things just happened along the way, and they pretty much did.
David Cruz, who I don't see here tonight, but he has this great theory that everybody, particularly successful people, have that one big break. And he wants to write a book. I shouldn't probably tell his plans, but he'd like to write a book on everybody's big break. And so what was your big break?
Man, my big break probably was, well, I'll answer that two ways. One, my big break was probably that when I decided finally to leave Greenville after 5 years, and I was invited to interview at the Miami Herald, the last person I interviewed was the executive editor, Larry Jinks, who was from Lake Village, Arkansas, and whose ambition when he was a young boy was to work for the Delta Democrat-Times for Harding Carter. And he could never get Harding to hire him for a Lake Village, Arkansas bureau. Lake Village is just across the river from Greenville, for those of you who don't know that. So when I walked into his office and sat down and started talking about the Delta, I felt like I was hired. You know, I felt like I had an in.
That's great.
But the story that got me going in Florida, I think, was when I started with the Herald, it was in the Palm Beach Bureau. Herald had bureaus all over the state at that time. It was this big monster of a newspaper. And you had to get noticed some way to move up to the main office. And I discovered that the garbage industry in Palm Beach County, all the companies that had carved up the county had 99-year leases. And I thought, something's wrong with that. That's extraordinary. You know, why 99-year leases? And the more I dug, the more interesting it got. It turned out that garbage industry in Palm Beach County was mob run. It was all guys, made guys from the Northeast. And I found all their names in congressional testimony. And then I started digging around, and I discovered that they had had their golf carts bugged by the FBI, that they were being followed all the time, and that the FBI was looking at the garbage industry. So then I started digging a little deeper, and I discovered that so was the state attorney. And we hustled around and broke this story before it got out into the public. And then we had another story right after that where I discovered that to get around paying for some of the garbage they dumped, their trucks were pulling up to the dump in the middle of the night. And they were dumping midnight garbage. And they had a key to the landfill. And they would go in, dump their garbage. It would not be recorded as being theirs. And so they would zoom off, and nobody would be the wiser. They were charged, you see, for a piece of each chunk of garbage they got. So the Herald loved that kind of stuff.
Did that lead to some convictions? Or?
It led to a grand jury investigation that forced the county commissioners, which is equivalent to our Board of Supervisors, that pushed those people finally into rebidding the contracts. And the garbage companies made not one complaint about that because they knew they were getting off light. But nobody went to prison. Nobody went to jail.
So what did that lead for you? Those stories led to what?
The Herald called me to Miami to cover the city of Miami. That was my first job, which was a pretty big job. You know, the city commission in Miami was extraordinary. The mayor, Maurice Ferre, was a real sophisticated guy. He was from Puerto Rico. His family was the Mall Concrete Empire, which was really big in Venezuela and Puerto Rico. So he was very wealthy. He'd been educated all over the world. He could speak French. He could speak Haitian Creole. He could speak German. He could speak Spanish, and he could speak English. And so I'd go to commission meetings, and there would be people from all these constituents in Miami, and they would be there, and they'd come up before the commission, and suddenly they'd switch to French. And Maurice would be speaking French with them, and I'd be running around the room trying to find an interpreter because I did not speak 5 languages. But it was a great beat to cover.
And you became good friends with him, right?
I did. We were good friends. And I'd write something, and he'd hate me on Monday. But by the next Monday, we were buddies again. It was that kind of relationship.
For all these aspiring journalists here, how do you bridge that fine line between friendship and objective coverage?
Well, the best thing to do is to stay away from getting too close. You know, I can think of people I got too close to over the years in Mississippi. The Speaker of the House was a guy named Buddy Newman. And Buddy and I just got to be friends because in the 1973 flood down in the South Delta, 2/3 of the South Delta was underwater. And I mean 10, 15, 20 feet of water. And Buddy was in charge of handling the relief efforts in that thing. So I went down there, cozied up to him, and we spent months crisscrossing the Delta in a boat. And you get to know somebody, you know, when you do that kind of thing. And he loved that I was writing about the relief efforts. So we became very close. But I noticed one thing about it. When he became Speaker, you would think of all the journalists in the state of Mississippi that the reporter in the biggest town in his legislative district would know if he's about to become Speaker of the House. But I got not a hint. And I learned something from that. Okay, you buddy up to a politician, do you get anything from it? Well, the answer, as you know, is almost never. You know, what they're doing is they're taking advantage of you. So the best thing to do is not to do it. Somehow, I wound up on good terms with a lot of them, though, over the years, I have to say.
At the Miami Herald, you had all these dream jobs, especially, in my opinion, is the beat to cover all the South for the Miami Herald. What was your favorite story that you covered for the Miami Herald in the South?
There are so many of them.
Was one of them about eating opossum?
Yeah, it was.
Tell that story.
I can't. I drive through Atlanta, and you try to keep your eyes open, of course, when you're a reporter. And I kept seeing these bumper stickers, "Eat Mo Possum." And finally, one day I thought, where do those come from? And so this guy's driving in front of me. He's in a pickup truck. He's got a Cobb County, just outside of Atlanta, license tag. So I followed him. I followed him, you know, through Atlanta. I followed him out into the suburbs. I followed him to his home. And he's getting out of his truck, and he sees me back there. And I walk up to him, and I said, "Look, I know you know I've been following you. The reason is I want to know where you got that bumper sticker." And he laughed. And it turned out that they came from Clanton, Alabama, where they had the International Possums and Possum Breeders and Growers Association. And the mayor of Clanton, Alabama, this guy with this big Coldstream Guards mustache, was the man that was in charge. So I drove over to Alabama one day, and I walked in his office. Big, spacious office, beautiful office. I'm sitting there talking to him, and he said, "Well, you want to know about possums?" And I said, "Yes, I do." So he's telling me all about possums. And he's telling me that possums are, that the possum meat they're selling is going to African nations as a source of protein, a cheap source of protein. And I said, "What are you telling me? Y'all are raising possums and selling them to Africa?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "The possum meat is 99% protein. It goes through your veins like a Roto-Rooter. It's great for you. But you don't gain weight because it's so lean. It's such a lean meat." And I said, "Yeah, but it stinks too." And he said, "Yes, but you know, we can take care of that with our careful public relations campaign." And so this conversation went along in that vein for a while. And finally he said, "And possum meat has the additional virtue of being an aphrodisiac." And I said, "Now, stop." I said, "Look, you know, I am a Southerner. I've been around for a while. I understand how much, you know, stuff we peddle. And, but right now it's about right here. It's up above my nose. And, you know, come on, give me a break." He said, "Oh, I can prove it to you." I said, "You're on." So he gets up from his chair, and he goes about 10 steps behind me to this big display of plants. And there's a tree stump in there, and he reaches into the tree stump and pulls out a possum. This is a live possum. And the possum is hissing. He's got these big sharp teeth, and he starts to drool. And the mayor holds him up by his tail, and he takes this coat from off a chair and lets it drip onto the sleeve a little bit, or actually onto the shoulder right here. And he puts the possum back down in the thing. And I said, "That thing was behind me the whole time I was sitting here?" He said, "Yep." So we drive out, and he goes to the bank, and he walks into the bank and walks behind the counter. And after he's the mayor. And all these women are coming up to him, and they're hugging him, and they're all hugging him on the right side. And he's looking at me like, kind of grinning like a possum. And I said, well, now, okay, this is a good trick. But how about let's go to this little town I passed driving over here. It's about 10 miles away. Let's go over there to the Dairy Queen. He said, okay. So we drove over, and we drove to the Dairy Queen. We walked in, and he walks in, and here are all these little waitresses running around. And he says, hi, how y'all doing? Hey, how you doing? And they're all cozying up to him on the right side. Now, you and I know that possum musk is not an aphrodisiac, but it was a great shtick. And I don't know how he pulled it off, but it was wonderful.
I told you Bill Rose was going to tell all tonight. Who's the most memorable person you met in covering the South?
Yeah. It might be Herman Talmadge. Herman Talmadge was a senator from the state of Georgia, and he was a powerful, powerful senator. He'd been there for a long, long, long time. And one year he was finally challenged, a serious challenger. He'd made the mistake of gotten caught drunk driving, and that hurt him. And so I'm following him around on the campaign trail the last week or two of the race. And Herman, as he was known, had this very bland personality until you got to know him and got him to relax. And he would appear before these audiences in Georgia, and he would campaign against the Atlanta newspapers, who were constantly writing about him. And the idea was he was going to be the friend of the poor and people who didn't read newspapers, or people who hated those liberal, lying Atlanta newspapers, as he called them. And so he would appear before these audiences, and he'd always have a stooge in the crowd. And he'd say, Jim Earl, he said, do you ever do any bird hunting around here? Yes, sir, Senator, all the time. Well, when you do you sometimes make a mistake and shoot a crow? He said, unfortunately. And Herman would say, what do you do with the crow? And he'd say, we throw them away. He said, well, ladies and gentlemen, I want y'all to do something for me. I know you're all bird hunters. But now, from now on, until the election, when you shoot a crow, save it. Put it in a bag. Send them to me. And then the night before the election, I'm going to take them over and dump them in front of the Atlanta Constitution and Journal, and we're going to have a feast. We're going to let the Atlanta Journal and them lying liberal newspaper reporters eat crow. And this is a big deal. This is a big speech all over. So I'm sitting there cackling at this, and I get in the car with him, and it's me and his highway patrol driver and Herman. I'm in the back seat, and we're driving along, and I said, you know, Governor, Senator, Atlanta's really changed over the years. You got this constituency and that constituency, diversity I was getting at. I said, in fact, it has one of the highest gay populations in the South. And he says, you're kidding. Turns around like he'd never heard that before. He's chewing on his cigar, and he's thinking about that for a while. He said, what kind of numbers they got? And I said, I don't know, but they claimed, blah, blah. They claim they got this many votes in a voting block. And Herman doesn't say a word. So I leaned back in the seat. That didn't go anywhere. And after about 5 minutes, he looks over at the patrolman and he says, Jim Willie, which is a great name. Jim Willie? Yes, sir, Senator. Tomorrow, Saturday, I want you to go down to Maynell's dress shop. I want you to buy a real nice dress and buy a pretty wig and go over to Piedmont Park, his language, not mine, and get me some queer votes. And I said, I'm just writing it down, as fast as I can write it down. And he just went on and on like that. So I wrote the story. It appeared in the Miami Herald, and he called me up. You pick up your telephone and it's Herman Talmadge. That's always interesting. And he said, I just want to thank you for putting that in the Miami Herald. You've helped me get a lot of votes out in the rural regions of Georgia.
So you think he was setting you up?
Senator? I don't know whether he was or not. Who knows? But I know he got beat. I will never forget driving over there. I went to bed election night, and he was leading, but it was closer than it needed to be. And I woke up that morning, I drove right over to his house, and had no trouble going in, walked in, sat down. He's on the phone to this guy, and he looks up, nods at me, and shakes his head. And he's telling this fellow over the telephone, yeah, George, I think them liberal lying Atlanta newspapers have finally got us. You know, I think we've lost.
Bill, a decision when you are in a career in journalism is whether to stay a reporter or to move into editing and management. Curtis stayed as a reporter all the time. You made a decision to move into editing. For all these aspiring, successful journalists, how hard is that decision, and what caused you to leave reporting and go into editing?
Well, it's going to show how stupid I am, because when they talked me into being an editor, I was in Atlanta, and I'd been there for 5 years and really having the time of my life. I've always felt like it was like Brer Rabbit being thrown in the briar patch. You know, it's what I always wanted to do. And they called me up and made the pitch, and I thought about it. And I thought, well, maybe we should do this because I'm on the road all the time. And my wife would like to occasionally see me. You know, my children would like to see me occasionally. And I was like a nomad, some poor wandering nomad, just roaming over the South from story to story to story. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And we went to Miami, and I became an editor. And of course, you work a lot longer hours as an editor. They still never saw me. But I have to say, it was fun. It was a lot more stress. And it was a lot of fun up until 2 years before I retired, when suddenly it became all about the money.
Let's wait till get there. Then you worked your way to be editor of the Sunday magazine, which had a great reputation nationally. Was that one of your more satisfying jobs?
That was a great job. I loved it because you're sitting down with the writers, and you're coming up with pieces that mean something, that are more than just the quick hits that the daily newspaper publishes. You're able to go deeper into the story, and you're able to craft a narrative. You're able to work on the finer points of writing and storytelling. You know, you can really show people what happened. Frequently, there would be a big story in Miami, and the Herald would cover it and do an excellent job. But then they turn to Tropic like a month later or 6 months later and say, how about going back and look at this and seeing what lessons we can learn? And we would frequently find out that there was a lot more to the story. And there often is. There always is, in fact. There's always much more to the story. When you're able to spend some real space on it, when you're able to dig, we would spend 3 weeks to produce a cover story. A special story we might spend a month working on. And there would be second drafts and third drafts, as all my former students know. And you really, really work it over before you get it done. And the editors spend as much time on it as the writers do, because it's a collaboration. At least that's the way we ran Tropic. It was very satisfying. We had we won a couple of Pulitzers, which was fun. And Tropic was a fun place to work because you had such characters there. I mean, you know, now newsrooms are kind of bland. They look like insurance offices, for God's sake. But in the old days, everybody had real character. Their desks had character. Their personalities were really wild and wacky. And they were cheeky in their responses to editors. There were great arguments and debates. Now it's kind of sterile and modern. But in Tropic, that didn't change. We had Dave Barry, who is a humor writer. I don't know how many of y'all have ever read any of his books, but you go to Square Books and you buy a book by Dave Barry, you're going to laugh a lot. And Dave installed a commode in his office, in the middle of the office. It worked. It was an operable commode. He came to work barefooted, and we didn't care because he did such good work. So those are the kind, we had Carl Hyacin, who many of you have read Carl Hyacin books over the years, who had this incredible rapier ability to just skewer public officials and define the hypocrisy in just about any story. So, it was fun. You get around and you have conversations with those people and you go do stories that are fun. You produce them, you see them, and Tropic often got results. And that's the most fun of journalism that I ever had. I mean, by God, to think that you could go and find out how to make government better, there's a novel thought. They're doing it wrong. Here's why they're doing it wrong. They're stealing here. Here's how they're doing it. Gosh, even back in Greenville, Mississippi, I did a story once just before I left. And it's interesting that they had me do it since they knew I was leaving. I think there was a reason for that. The police chief was running around. There was a bad element, kind of a Gulf Coast organized crime family that had moved into Greenville, and they were buying up the juke joints out in the county, outside the city limits. And the police chief couldn't touch them because they were in the sheriff's territory, and the sheriff was kind of, like sheriffs sometimes could be. You didn't know whose side he was on. So the police chief went around at night with one of his officers, and they would firebomb these juke joints. And, we had been doing daily stories about these juke joints burning down. Well, listen to this interesting. And then I found out what it was all about. And I talked to policemen who actually saw the police chief leaving the scene of a couple of firebombings. We put all that in the newspaper on the front page, top strip. There was a grand jury investigation. By the way, he was running for mayor at the time. And by the way, he got elected even after that article. So that's how much clout I had. And a grand jury refused to indict him. Everybody knew he was guilty, but they loved him so much. He was so beloved because he really was. Listen, you're going to laugh at this, but he really was an excellent police chief. He just had this one little flaw. And a lot of the people I wrote about over the years were like that. They would seem to have stellar lives, but you scratch, just a little bit below the surface, and oh my God, look at this.
I talked to the editor of the Miami Herald when the Sunday News magazine had to fold because of economics. And he said he offered you basically any job you wanted, and you instead went to Palm Beach Post. Why did you do that? Well,
at first I didn't go to the Post. At first I took the job of, we created a job of writing coach. So I would move around the newsroom and I'd find a particular story that looked juicy, and I'd work with the reporter on that story to craft it, to really make it more powerful. And that was fun. But then the Palm Beach Post came to me and said, do this, we'll make you managing editor, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, you know what? I'm never going to do that here. The line is too long. And I've always stayed away from management. But now my children are gone. They're out of the house. It's me and Susan. And Miami is, they're closing down Tropic for financial reasons. They're starting to contract. I can just see it. But the Palm Beach paper at the time was expanding.
Privately owned?
Yep. No, Cox. It was owned by Cox.
That's what I mean.
Yep,
it was not stock.
It was not stock.
So the editor of the Herald told me that when you left, he said, it broke my heart. And that rarely comes from hard-bitten editors, rarely say something like that.
Broke my heart.
It did.
Sure.
Wow.
I loved the Herald.
And the people.
I love the people. Miami. Listen, Miami is a great town, and to go there and to as a know-nothing and succeed and to have fun at doing it, made a lot of friends in that newsroom.
And so, were you glad that you went to Palm Beach, and do you think you accomplished something there?
Yeah. That was a lot of fun. It turned out. You know, if I had it to do all over again, frankly, I'd remain a reporter because it's more fun. But I wouldn't have accomplished as much, and that's the rub. We decided, you know, when I got there, look, this is a meat and potatoes newspaper. It does a good job of covering all the little bitty nitty-gritty things that go on all over Palm Beach County. Government, 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 government. I wanted to lighten it up a little. I wanted to toughen it up a little bit. I wanted to, in other words, I wanted to focus the coverage. I wanted to do investigative stories because I could see a lot of wealth in Palm Beach County in the hands of a lot of public officials. And I knew what that meant, and it wasn't good. And I could see that we had a newspaper readership. We had a lot of people in Palm Beach County who'd moved down from the Northeast and they'd read newspapers all their lives. And they were fertile. You know, that was great. You had a readership who really cared about the community they lived in. And they depended on the newspaper to tell them what was going on in that community. But we weren't telling them what was going on. We wanted to tell them what was really going on. So we dug beneath government, and we found a lot of stuff. I hired away the best investigative reporter from the Miami Herald, Tom DeBach, and brought him to brought him to Palm Beach. And I said, Tom, look at the county commission. Something's wrong. I want you to get to the bottom of it. So he went over there to investigate, and he said, we'll start with the chairman. The guy's name was Tony Massalotti. It took Tom about 3 weeks. And he came back to me and he said, oh, this is bad stuff. And he had found a little kernel of information in a divorce file. And the guy was buying up land along the still yet to be announced route of this improved road that was going to go through the Glades area west of Palm Beach County, west of West Palm Beach. And we followed that thread and found that he was doing all kinds of things. I mean, bribery was involved, questionable zoning decisions. So we just kept investigating. Before it was over with, we had sent 2 county commissioners to jail. Then we got a 3rd. Then we got a lobbyist. Then we got the former zoning chief. And then we got a bag man. We sent them all to federal prison. And U.S. District Judge William Hoovler, who was a no-nonsense judge, who was not a great friend of the press, at the sentencing of the first commissioner, took pains to say that this would never have happened were it not for the dogged reporting of the Palm Beach Post. I can't tell you what that does. That warms the heart of an old journalist. That was great. I felt like, okay, I've accomplished this. And we kept going. We got a city commissioner and some other people. And, you know, I know this sounds ruthless, but these people are doing something wrong. They're stealing money. They're taking money that doesn't belong to them. They're betraying the public trust. So I slept pretty well at night.
Do you think newspapers are still doing that?
Yeah, they are. Not as much as I'd like to see. Not as aggressively as I'd like to see. They don't have the manpower, for one thing. The big ones, of course, do. The New York Times, the LA Times, some of the other papers are still doing it. You know, there's Jerry Mitchell at the Clarion Ledger, but they're few and far between. And what happens to those guys is they're juggling too many other tasks now, so they're not just focused on investigation. You need somebody to investigate the people who need investigating. Otherwise, it doesn't get done. The federal officials, the state officials can't do it all. And so it's, that's really the role of the newspaper. But we also made that a writer's newspaper, the Palm Beach Post. We couldn't be the Miami Herald. We weren't that big, we didn't have all those resources, but by God, we could write it better, you know, if we set out to do that. So I really stressed writing. I spent a lot of time leaving my office, leaving things I should have been doing probably from a management perspective, and sitting down with the reporters and editors to talk about stories. It's more fun anyway.
Well, you retired from the Palm Beach Post, and you told when you told me why, I think it shows your heart. Tell everybody why you retired from the Palm Beach Post.
Well, we grew at that newspaper. The first 8 years I was there as managing editor. And we were one of the few newspapers that was showing that kind of growth. We were the most, we made more profit at that newspaper than any newspaper in Cox, including Atlanta. And then something called the Florida housing crisis hit. And the bottom fell out of our advertising. And we went in 1 month's time, with January, February, March, April, May, we were making record profits and leading the corporation. June, we were last. We went from black to red in 1 month. Never seen anything like that. And it stayed bad. And it stayed bad for the whole final 2 years I was there. And so we started contracting. When I got to the Palm Beach Post over the first 8 years, we expanded the newsroom from something like 150 journalists to 250. And it was great. And we were setting up bureaus, we were doing things, we were sending reporters all over, including out of the country. And then they came to me and they said, you need to lay off half of these people in your newsroom. So we had to do that in 1 day. And, you know, we read up on how people were doing it, and it was really cold how everybody was doing it. And frankly, that's the way they wanted us to do it. They wanted us to just call them in and, you know, be that. So we insisted on being honest with them. And we also wanted to praise their work, let them know that it had been, what they had done had been worthwhile, even though the company was now seemingly falling apart. So we put on a big presentation in which they rejoiced over past victories at the Palm Beach Post. And then we made the decision on who was going to go and who was going to stay. That was very harrowing. Only one of those people came into my office and was upset over leaving. They were all upset, but none of them expressed it. In fact, most of them were grateful for the way it was handled. But it took a toll on me. I couldn't stand it. And so the next year, when they came back to me and said, we're going to have to do some more, you know, and they started throwing numbers around, I went home that night and I told Susan, I can't do this anymore. I can't tell people they have to leave. And so in desperation, I called my financial advisor and said, can I retire? And she said, when? And I said, now, like tomorrow. And she said, let me get back to you. And she did and said, yeah, sure, you can retire. Don't worry about it. And so I went in and said, hey guys, I'm retiring. And you know, it's a funny thing. They were nice enough to give me a little buyout, even though I'd already told them I was leaving. But also, they named as my successor my deputy, which I was thrilled about. Tim Burke was wonderful. He could do my job so much better than I could. And that's what you want in a deputy. And so he was going to become the managing editor. And then they decided, no, we're going to shrink the newspaper some more. He's going to be the editor. And so they would save my job. They'd make money off eliminating it. And so what they did was, Tim came to me and said, you're supposed to leave Friday. Don't do it. Stay for a couple of months and run the newspaper for me while I take these people and have regular meetings every day to try to figure out how we're going to reposition this newspaper, how we're going to redo it, how we're going to reorganize, really do it right. And I said, Tim, I'd be glad to do it, but I do not want to be making decisions down here and then be second guessed about them at a time when I really just want to go home. And he said, don't worry about it, I'll stay out of your hair. And I said, okay. And it was like an enormous burden had been lifted off my shoulders. You know, I didn't have to worry about what somebody was going to think above me, which was really revealing. It told me something about myself. That had been a weakness that I had had. And I was just making decisions all day long. Man, I had no trouble, you know. Nobody's going to talk to me. I'm not going to worry about it. You just make a decision and move on. Made some of the best decisions I ever made, quicker than I'd ever made them.
So you retired, and it's a long way from West Palm Beach to Oxford, Mississippi. What was the thinking to get you here?
Susan and I sat around and I said, okay, we want to leave Florida. We've been in Florida for 25 years, maybe 30. And where do we go? And I tried to get her to tell me where she wanted to go. She didn't do it. She's always said, I'll go where you go. It'll be fine. And which is the biggest mistake of her life. So I said, well, okay, let's take a look at some places I'd like to live. I said, Nashville, New Orleans, there's Memphis, you know, there's Atlanta. You know, we could even live in Oxford. And she said, oh, I'd like to live in Oxford. Her college roommate still lives here. Of course, we had gone to school here. And my mother lived in Memphis at the time. And Gail was the caretaker, my sister. So I was able to move back to Oxford and be close to my mother in the latter years of her life. I think she was 92.
She didn't come here.
90 at the time.
You planned to retire here. You didn't really plan to work here, did you?
No, I really didn't, but I knew that I needed to do something. So I thought, well, I'll check and see. And I walked over to journalism school one day. Actually, I think Ed Meek called me and said, you know, they're trying to fill this job at the journalism school. And, you know, the dean wants you. And I said, well, he doesn't know anything about me. So it turned out that Joe Storita from the Miami Herald, who used to be my New York bureau chief, had been working for Will in Nebraska in his previous incarnation. And they had had conversations, and Joe had said, look up Bill Rose because he's moving there. So I walked over to the journalism building one day just to say hi, and I ran into this guy in the hallway with no hair. And I'm right behind you, Will. I'm getting there. And I looked at him, and he looked at me. And I said, Will Norton? And he said, Bill Rose? Mm-hmm. So we went and had conversations and talked, and the job came out of it.
And so you oversaw 8 in-depth reports, including some international reports. What's the best thing that came out of that?
Best thing. Whew. You know, the best thing that came out of it was the confidence that I saw in some of the students who went through the course and got out of it at the end of it and said, oh yeah, this is how this can work. I can do this. I can do this. Now I understand it better. That was thrilling because I felt like, you know, I actually accomplished something.
So I'm going to go to the audience for some questions here before we finish. But Bill, what's the one piece of advice you'd give students getting ready to go out in the work world today?
Prepare to work hard. Best advice I can give you before you go out into the world is to know that people aren't going to do everything for you. And you're not entitled to anything. I mean, you're going to have to scrap for everything you get. And you need to find a way to separate yourself from the hordes. You're going to be surrounded by a whole bunch of people like you. Some of them have got more experience than you. Some of them have got ends, you know, and you don't. And you're going to go in cold. It's like putting your big toe into a bathtub of cold water. And from the very beginning, you have got to hustle more than anybody else. You got to run faster than anybody else. And you have to find a way to be smarter than anybody else. And if that scares you, it should. That's what I'm trying to do. You've got to separate yourself. What can I do that will get me noticed? What can I do that will give an extra effort? Because that's what those supervisors are looking for. They're looking for somebody they don't have to spend time mollycoddling. They're looking for somebody who they can say, I can trust her. I can trust him. And they'll go out and they're going to get to the bottom of this. That's what I would suggest. And I would suggest don't do the little soft, fluffy feature stories. Learn to dig. Learn to look for hypocrisy. Learn to look for people who are doing things the wrong way. If that sounds like I'm being negative, fair enough, so be it. You've got to be in this business. You've got to go look and you've got to dig. If you don't do that, you're just going to get swept up.
Questions from the audience? Who'll go first? Yes, ma'am.
So it's interesting to me that you're talking about Senator Talmadge and his view of the future. I think in this environment, we get the sense that it's never been more adversarial between politicians and journalists. Would you say that that's always been a part of it, and that it's really no different than it was?
Oh no, it's very different. It's meaner. It is meaner. I mean, what you see is politicians being willing to take on the very notion of a free press, to attack it in a way that undermines the public's confidence in it, that makes it appear more flawed than it really is. Press makes mistakes. It's always made mistakes. It has always made mistakes. It's an institution composed of human beings, and human beings are flawed. They're going to make mistakes. But the press does not just get a story and slap it in the paper. It's filtered through a whole bunch of editors who are challenging it. And they're human too, and they make mistakes too. So but in the old days, you'd make a mistake, people complain about it, and you move on. Nowadays, it becomes a federal case. It becomes, fake news. That's the phrase that's used. And it's kind of like trying to punch a pillow. You can't get anything in traction in it to get people to be specific about it. It's just a label that's thrown out there. And that's the danger. It's meaner and it's tougher. It's nastier. It used to not be that way at all. I remember Edwin Edwards was kind of the pirate king of Louisiana, the governor several times down there. Colorful politician, constantly at war with the press. But he loved it, and he enjoyed the press, and he enjoyed the combat. Those days are over. I'll never forget Edwin Edwards. To give you an example, we're down in Louisiana, and he's campaigning for a guy who's going to eventually get beat. But the guy is desperate for votes, and he wants to be Edwin Edwards' successor, because Edwards is going to be term limited out, and he needs votes in Cajun country, and Edwin Edwards, he can speak Cajun. He can get out there with them. So he takes this guy through the Cajun parishes. And we stop at this Holiday Inn in Lafourche Parish. And Edwards retreats to this hotel room. And it's locked and the windows are drawn. And he's in there for 30 minutes. And everybody's wondering in the press, what's going on? Who's in there? And in the room next door, the same thing. So he's got two rooms cordoned off. Something's going on in there. People are in there. They're having conversations. What's going on? What's happening? So finally, Edwin Edwards comes out for this reception. And we ask him, Governor, who were you meeting with in there? He says, I was meeting with my good friend Carlos Marcello. Well, Carlos Marcello was the mob boss, down in Louisiana. We go, huh? What do you say? Are you serious? Of course I'm serious. It's my best friend. Don't you know that? And they would carry on like that. It was fun, it was a game to him. Then we go inside the Holiday Inn, and he winks to the reporters. He says, y'all think I'm so bad? He said, watch this. Starts going through the reception line. Turns out there's 2 reception lines. Louisiana is different. The men are in this line. The women are in this line. He goes to the women. There's about 50 of them. They're all lined up there grinning from ear to ear. He says, "Hey, baby." Lays one on her, and they kiss. And she says, "Give me one for my sister." "Give me one for my aunt." And this would go on all down the line. And the men are over here, and they're just guffawing at this. They just think that's wonderful. And then he gets through, and they give him a standing ovation. And that was it. That was the campaign appearance. He kissed well.
Wow.
It doesn't happen anymore like that.
Other questions? Up here. Yes, sir.
You editor of the Herald when Michael Lucille is back in Greenville.
Yes.
And so when you talk about how they developed, you talk about enterprising as a journalist.
Yeah, well, Michael Lucille was an exceptional photographer. Left the Herald to go to the Washington Post, where he was an even more exceptional photographer. And we had written for years and years about a place called the Graveyard. And it was a African-American housing project in Liberty City in Miami, a place that had been torn by riots over the years. Cops were afraid to go in there. People were afraid to live there, but they had no choice. Drug infested, all kinds of problems going on in this place. And we'd written about it, but if you go back and read all the stories, they were so general. They used all these catchphrases and labels. You know, it dawned on us, nobody really went and lived there with these people. You want to find out what it's like, you go live there with these people. So Michael Lucille practically lived there for a while, got to know people, moved around, stayed at night, was there early in the morning, you know, was there when gunfire broke out, walked across the ground and saw all the needles lying there. And he documented these people's lives, the darkness, the gloom, the despair. It's just, you know, you get there and there's nowhere else to go. It's pretty bad. It would take me a long time to really explain how he did it, but that'll give you a general idea. And he just took photographs of it all. And we ran them in Tropic. We ran some of them in the Herald as well. And it won the Pulitzer Prize. So, you know, it was negative, it was bad, but it needed to be done.
Other questions? In the back, yes.
Yeah, so when you're dealing with the mob stories this weekend, have you ever actually threatened or bribed or really digging into people's business?
A couple of times. Only once was I really worried.
Was that threatened or bribed?
No, it was a threat.
Oh,
I would have preferred the bribe. I was never bribed. I wish they had. You know, what happened was, this is silly. I wrote about a deputy sheriff's son who was convicted of assault and battery and sent to the state pen for a year or two because he'd had prior offenses. And he was trouble. The deputy was a wonderful guy, great source. Used him for sources on stories all the time. But he had this other son that was just as troubled as the first son. And that one called me up after I'd written the story. And he says, "I saw the story you had." And it was in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock, you know, Susan's sleeping in the bed next to me. I answer the phone. I expect it to be an editor sending me somewhere. And no, this guy wants to threaten me, wants to beat me up. Says, "I know how to do it, so I'll only get a month or 2 in jail, you know, but it'll really hurt you. And you know I know how to do it." And I did know he knew how to do it. And he said, "If you ever write about my family again, I'm going to do it." And I listened to him very carefully. And I said, "Okay, okay, I won't write about it again." And hung up the phone. The next day I went and reported it. And of course they reported it to the police. And I never heard anything else. But I looked over my shoulder for a couple of weeks. You know, I had a guy in the Klan once who wasn't happy about what we had written. And he called up. And he made threatening remarks. But, you know, those guys hide behind the sheets. They're not going to do anything. And that was it. That's really it. There were people that got mad a lot, but generally, they didn't stay mad. You know, it's a strange thing, and I just want to mention this real quick. I did an expose once of a supervisor in Greenville, Mississippi. Actually, he was out in the county outside of Greenville. Wonderful man, been supervisor for something like 25 or 30 years. And I found out that he was building a county road along property that he planned to subdivide. That's a no-no. He's improving the value of his property with public money. And so I went out to write a story about it, and I went all over the courthouse gathering my material. And of course he knew, because he'd been around a while, he knew what I was doing. And so I'm getting ready to interview him, and even before I could go approach him, he approaches me. He says, I hear you asking questions about my road. And I said, yes, sir, Mr. Jeff, I am. And he said, you know, come, I'll talk to you. He said, roads are good. Roads open up the county, and they bring people in, and you know, blah, blah, and the population increases, and blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, Mr. Jeff, it also improves you. And he said, well, you know, I don't know. It might not. And so we had this very frank conversation. He was wonderful. And so I wrote the story. And he had a son who was elected to the Board of Supervisors. And Jeff didn't run for re-election. And his son did, and he got elected. And I was really worried about how we were going to get along. And so the first day we were there, I went up and introduced myself to him. And Cecil said, I know who you are. He said, I saw the story you wrote about my daddy, and I was really mad. I was going to come looking for you. But my daddy told me that you're all right, that you were fair to him. So I want you to know that. And I said, well, thank you. And, you know, I wrote stories about Cecil as well, and we remain good friends to this day.
Last question? Yes.
What was your favorite memory from the Daily Mississippian?
Daily Mississippian. Oh, my
Going back a ways.
Oh, let's see. I can't use that one. You know, we were at the Daily Mississippian. We were, that time, the journalism school was in an old wood frame house that was on the other side of the grove from us. And it was named Farley Hall, wasn't it?
That was Brady Hall.
Brady, thank you. Brady Hall. And it was just an old wooden house. And when you'd walk on the floors, creak, creak, they were uneven. And you'd step on them sometimes and you'd think, boy, that's going to collapse one day. And you'd come in there the next day, and sure enough, it had, and they were working on it. You know, it's that kind of thing. And it was cold in there in the winter, and it was hot in the, all that stuff. It was this weird little building. And it had a dark room in it, very large dark room. Students, you know, would go in there and work at night. Can you imagine that, Dr. Norton? They would have keys, and they would go into the journalism school, and they would work at night. Well, working on the student paper, of course, we had to do it, but there were others who came in there to do class work in the dark room. One night, they were doing something more than class work in the dark room. A young man and a young woman were in there, and you know, I got ready to leave, and I was going out the front door, and who should come in but Dr. Sam Talbert, the chairman of the department. And I said, hey, Dr. Talbert. He said, how are you? And I said, just fine. And he started walking back towards the dark room. And he said, I said, who are you looking for? He said, I'm looking for so-and-so. I said, oh, yeah, he's back there. Go ahead. And just what you're thinking happened.
Well, he tells all, doesn't he? So I want to close this program out with two quotes. One from Dr. Norton when he was asked about Bill's role in helping the students with the in-depth reports. He said about Bill, he did not merely teach students how to write, he taught them how to live, which I think is a great quote. And then the last quote came from one of his colleagues named Tom Schroeder. It was in a profile that I wrote for the Meek magazine. Tom Schroeder said this about Bill. He just walked around with a sparkle of magic about him, a kind of glow that made everyone he came in contact with have a better, more memorable day than they otherwise would have had. That shows the humanity of Bill Rose in addition to his great professionalism. Bill, thank you for a great career.
Thank you. Oh, Lord.